Do you think Donald Trump miscalculated or underestimated Iran's response?
He did miscalculate. Everybody knew that this was a possibility, and they seem to not have been as well prepared for it as they might have been.
How do you read the situation which is currently on?
Economic warfare, which is essentially using fear and a few select attacks on ships in the Strait of Hormuz to disrupt the world's energy supply in a way that really hasn't happened in 50 years.
Do you see this war ending with an Iranian win?
It strikes me as quite unlikely that either the United States or Israel will successfully topple the Iranian regime and replace it with another regime altogether. That leads to a scenario where whoever is in charge, whether it's Mojtaba or somebody else, can declare victory and say the Iranian revolution lives on to fight another day.
Whose objective has been achieved and whose objective is yet to be achieved?
I don't see a lot of evidence that Donald Trump is doing things for other countries. He's probably looking for a way to declare victory and looking for a win. And I think he's been willing to take a whole lot of risk for the United States to get to a place where he thinks the country looks strong.
Is the threshold for the off-ramp for American victory too high? Because President Trump said he expects unconditional surrender.
I think he would accept something far short of unconditional surrender at the right moment. If he felt like he could contain the nuclear program and find some way to deal with the missile program and end this war and get oil flowing again, I suspect he would take something far less than unconditional surrender.
From Washington's perspective, how does India's cautious approach look?
All the GCC states, it's pretty clear that they see India as a future superpower, not just as a sort of place to receive labor and send capital, but as a major arbiter of 21st century life.
President Trump's allegation that it was essentially President Biden's administration that gave billions to the Iranian regime, and that money essentially went straight into this missile program.
President Trump has an unerring ability to find and locate the fault for various policies with others. The reports about Iran getting billions and billions of dollars from President Biden, I think, were inaccurate.
$6 billion?
Right, but
Sizable amount.
they didn't get that money. That's the thing, they never got that money.
Namaste, Jai Hind. You're watching or listening to another edition of the NI podcast with Smita Prakash. My guest today is Daniel Benaim, who has served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Peninsula Affairs at the U.S. State Department. He previously advised President Joe Biden on Middle East policy and has worked at the White House and the U.S. Senate. He also wrote speeches for Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and other senior U.S. officials. He closely follows developments in West Asia and the U.S. foreign policy. I'm joined by my colleague, Ishan Prakash. Thank you. Thank you very much for being part of the podcast, Daniel. Great to have you here. Of course, I wish it had been under better circumstances, peace. But then with the West Asian situation being, so volatile, I wanted to know, you've overseen U.S. diplomacy with Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait. How do you read the situation which is currently on?
Well, thank you so much, Smita.
That's right.
You can record over this.
That's fine, yes.
No, but thank you very much, Smita, for the question, and my greetings to all of your listeners. Look, I think that this war began, this round of this war began because the United States and Israel saw a chance to weaken Iran. And for the perspective of the United States, they didn't have as much of a fleshed out plan beyond that for what would happen. They thought they could weaken Iran at an acceptable cost. And then they thought that perhaps something good would happen after that. Perhaps they would find leadership that was more agreeable. Perhaps they would get Iran to capitulate. And perhaps the regime would be overthrown. I think these were more wishes than plans, let's say. Iran responded by pursuing three big vectors of pressure. They bombed 8-10 countries, including every country in the Gulf, including Oman, which was begging the United States to avoid this war. And Iran tried to create diplomatic pressure on the United States, mostly via the Gulf. It failed. Gulf countries have not applied that pressure. They've been alienated by the strikes. They tried to apply military pressure, and there we're in a kind of cat and mouse game over the nature of interceptor stocks. We've been degrading their missile and drone capabilities. And they've been using shorter-range missiles and cheaper drones and running out of supplies. So we're in a bit of a race against time, but we've been using expensive interceptors against cheap drones and missiles. And that is the kind of asymmetry we're up against. But the last tool that they've used is economic warfare, which is essentially using fear and a few select attacks on ships in the Strait of Hormuz to disrupt the world's energy supply in a way that really hasn't happened in 50 years. And that tool, I think, is going to be quite effective. All of these tools over time, what they're aiming to do is create pressure on the United States to change course and ultimately reign in Israel. And if you're Iran, I think what you've been trying to do is to win by not losing, which is essentially to survive and declare victory, and to say that the United States has lost by not winning. But as always happens in every war, dynamics emerge from the inside of that war that begin to change things. I guess that probably the Trump administration, when they saw that no great gain was going to come and that they were weakening Iran and that their secondary goals would not be met, would want to end this war fairly quickly and would have thought that they could just stop when they felt ready. But what's happened is that the Iranians, because of the traction that they've gained in this economic warfare and this sort of weapon of mass disruption, let's call it, because of that, they may be now intoxicated by their levers that they're able to pull and trying to reach for a new objective, which would be not only to win by not losing, but to win by teaching the United States a lesson and restoring a degree of deterrence for Iran so that the next time America or Israel or anyone else wants to engage in military force, a series of countries around the world who have suffered a great deal of pain line up to tell them, please don't do this, and put some muscle into that message. So I think that's the moment we're at. It seems to me that the United States may want to escalate from where we are now. Trump seems eager to find some way to regain control of this narrative that is getting away from him. He wants to go to China to see Xi Jinping at the end of the month and probably resents the idea that his big moment on the world stage with the second most powerful man in the world is going to be overshadowed by a war that he chose and a decision that he made and lost control of. So I think he would probably want to do that. But as often happens in these things, when one party chases, the other party runs. And when the other party chases, the original party runs. And that's part of why it's so hard to end these wars. And frankly, that is part of why it is so difficult to start a war without a clear and limited goal in mind, because you're subject to this kind of evolution, which you could uncharitably but perhaps accurately call mission creep. But certainly there's a drift at work.
So whose objective has been achieved and whose objective is yet to be achieved? Israel and the US, because they started the war, right?
Right. I think they did. And there were legitimate threats that Israel faced from a growing Iranian missile supply that should not be trivialized because Israel had limited air defenses and Iran's missile program was barreling ahead. That's a real problem. It didn't necessarily require an immediate war to decapitate the leadership and launch a 6-week military campaign with the most powerful country in the world.
So whose objective was that? Do you think it was Israel's objective to decapitate and bring about a regime change? Was regime change an objective for either the US or Israel?
I think that for Israel, the most immediate goal was to deal with the missiles, and then everything else was a bit of a nice to have. And frankly, because they were levering the most powerful military of the United States, they had to see what kind of political space and latitude existed to pursue these bigger goals and what happened. Because again, war is a force that immediately injects an element of unpredictability into events. The supreme leader is killed. Can you or I or Israeli intelligence or American intelligence honestly say that we know what will happen after that? I think not. And even now, I as is probably clear, I'm a critic of this war and this strategy. But even now, I would say that when this war ends, we still don't know what will happen politically inside Iran in terms of what the Iranian people will do, in terms of what various elements of this new regime will do. And it is a new regime in the sense that, by and large, all of the leadership that defined the last 30 years of it have been eliminated. There are residual forces, a few key players who remain, but a lot of the leadership has changed. So we just don't know what will happen. But what we're seeing now is that unpredictability. To get back to your question, for the United States, I think the first objective really was to degrade Iran's military capabilities. They had already done that with the military program, but they hadn't dealt with some of the other tools that Iran had. And I think that that was their objective in part because they felt that that could be their objective. That was what they knew that they could do. They knew that in 4 or 5 weeks, working closely with Israeli intelligence and the military, they could degrade the missile program to a large extent, the launchers and the missiles themselves, especially the longer range ones that can reach beyond the Gulf to Israel. They knew that they could go after Iranian military leadership and command and control. They knew that they could sink the Iranian Navy. and they knew that they could deal them a blow that would leave them compromised from a perspective of missiles and conventional capabilities. But beyond that, they didn't really define their goals, which was a kind of very unusual and improvisational approach to war. Israel, I think, knew what they wanted. They knew what was nice they needed to have. They knew what would be great to have, and they had to see what they could accomplish. America knew what their military could accomplish, and they had to see what political effects that could achieve. That's not our usual way of war, where objectives are usually tightly tied back to your means. Right. If you go back to Clausewitz, you're really trying to achieve an effect. You're trying to use a military means to achieve a political or strategic effect. Here, I think they knew that the objective they had, but they didn't really know what effect they'd be able to achieve, so they didn't bother to define it too tightly. And now you're seeing the drift that comes from that lack of a limiting and clarifying set of principles at the start of a war.
One of the objectives in this war, sir, was about also stopping essentially the proliferation of the uranium enrichment of Iran. You talked about mission creep as well. We also heard news where a Marine expedition, the Marines Expeditionary Force has been dispatched over there, where close to 5,000 Marines are heading towards the area. Do you foresee any ground invasion by America to secure the uranium that's left with Iran?
You know, there's a few military missions that are still possible here. And ordinarily, I would say that we probably wouldn't do them because they're so high risk. And because Donald Trump came in forswearing the idea of what he has called the dumb wars of his predecessors. So I would say no. But again, war creates emergent possibilities, emergent exigencies. And where he is now is that he's probably looking for a way to declare victory and looking for a win. And I think he's been willing to take a whole lot of risk for the United States to get to a place where he thinks the country looks strong. The two big military missions that are sort of outstanding out there, number one is to either take over or damage badly Kharg Island, which is the key energy refinery.
Which happened probably on the weekend.
Right, they started and they went after some targets, but they didn't really destroy the key energy infrastructure. And I don't think they want to, because I think they want Iran to have a long-term outlet for oil, which is something that the president thinks about a lot. The United States could theoretically occupy that, but I think it would be personally quite foolish because you'd leave a lot of Americans exposed. The other mission that responds to a very urgent and real need under these circumstances is to deal with highly enriched uranium, which seems to be at two sites in Iran, one of which is deep underground. American special forces have shown that they can do remarkable and complex things around the world. This is even more remarkable and even more complex than some of the kinds of things that they've been asked to do. And either they could spend a short time on the ground and disable the uranium and risk all kinds of environmental and radiological challenges, or send in a team of soldiers and scientists to capture an area inside Iran, subject again to military attack and everything else, and try to capture that and exfiltrate it and bring it back. I think the problem at the end of the day is that when you're pursuing all of these means short of regime change, what's left open is the possibility that Iran will reconstitute all of these things with nothing left to lose, and that you'll have a situation a lot like the 1990s and Saddam Hussein in Iraq, where you had a war and the powerful military showed that it could beat back this set of asymmetric forces, but that created a hardened regime opponent with much less to lose that was much more willing to lash out in more different ways, including pursuing or at least threatening to pursue toward the end a nuclear program.
You know, when you talk about ground forces, I mean, everybody's talking about ground forces, and Iran is a large country, and the topography it's so complex. It's like Europe. It's so large. You've got mountains, you've got caves, and it's like you saw what happened with Afghanistan. Ground troops cannot get into that country and control it. It's extremely hard.
That's why it was, since it was about 5,000 forces, the only speculation that one could think was that they would try and secure those two sort of
just islands,
Isfahan and Natanz, those two nuclear sites that are there, and maybe secure that nuclear material, because the nuclear question was one of the big objectives as well of the Trump administration when they launched this offensive, the second round of offensive over here. I want to talk about the more pressing topics right now, the breaking news, so to say, and then we can further zoom out, if you will. What do you make of President Trump reaching out to all of these countries to try and get an alliance going on for the Strait of Hormuz to try and open it up? I mean, on one day, he threatens these countries with a trade war. The second day, he's seeking assistance to open up the Straits of Hormuz. What do you think? Do you think these countries will play ball?
I think countries are sort of figuring out how to manage their national interests vis-a-vis Trump and vis-a-vis their supply of energy. And that will create probably some heroic flexibility in dealing with both Donald Trump and Iran from some of these countries. They've also seen their own people attacked in the Gulf and their close partners attacked in the Gulf. So I think you may see countries that are willing to engage in a kind of military protection to get ships through the Gulf. Some of those same countries will probably be talking to Iran directly to make sure that Iran does not attack them as they remove their supply of oil from the
India.
Gulf. For all of which may actually help the United States alleviate political pressure by putting more oil out into a global market. So this is really sort of 3D chess. But to get to your underlying question, there's a reason historically that the United States in particular, has had a doctrine of seeking other countries' support, consultation, etc., before going to war. In the 1990s, when we had a very cumbersome set of arrangements in the Balkans, Wes Clark said the only thing worse than going to war with allies is going to war without them. And this war was not handled like that. No, there was the United States and Israel, and it was kind of, thanks everybody else. We'll handle it from here. And, if you want to benefit from what we achieve, great. The arrogance of that, I think, was shown in what happened.
Yeah.
And the unpredictability of war itself, as I keep returning to. So I think, there's a kind of bit of a about face from the president, who's made a few about faces in his time, from trash talking to now asking for help while also continuing to deliver threats about the future of NATO and other things. I think he believes that America's coercive power is sort of more fundamental to his use of power than his convening power, inherent kind of attractive and convening power. But he kind of feels like he can use both together without really, without seeing an underlying contradiction. But I think a lot of other countries do see that contradiction, but then at the end of the day, they'll come back to their national interests, which in many cases lie with America.
Yeah, so the national interests, and then not agreeing to come to the aid of the ships, the navies in the Strait. Is it reshaping alliances, or is it going to reshape alliances in the West Asian region?
It's so early to say. I've been thinking about this from a Gulf perspective, because you really, in this war, you have this post-1979 revolutionary resistance ideology of the Iranians. You have a post-October 7th national security doctrine of Israel that has taken the old ways of deterrence, overwhelming force for deterrence, and replaced it with a kind of doctrine of preemption that says that where there's a capability overseas that threatens us, we can't afford to let it linger and expect that we'll deter it. We have to go after it. That, I think, comes straight from the national trauma that they experienced that morning of October 7th and onward. And but it creates a real problem for a third kind of regional pole, which is the Gulf, which has a pre-2030 mentality, which relies on calm, on détente, on de-escalation, on globalization, on ties to places like India, which all the Gulf countries are hungry to build and working to build, to create something better. That approach is fundamentally challenged by this moment.
True.
They looked for America to provide security, and America is defending alongside them, and it has armed them and has trained them to shoot these Iranian missiles and drones out of the sky at an unbelievable rate. But it's also American troops being there that is part of what exposed them to Iran.
Yes.
And so that paradox is not lost on any Arab leader that has spent this time.
Did they expect it? Do you think that they gamed that at all?
Yes. I think that they all have been working closely with the United States. They're all, if you really push them in their heart of hearts, know that Iran is a dangerous adversary who they're trying to manage. But they look at the region and they say, we're determined to build what we want inside our countries, and we're willing to make all kinds of deals with the devils outside to make that happen. And that applies to Iran and the Houthis and countless others. That's what they've done. They've had a détente with Iran that has been remarkably durable. Israel and Iran shot missiles back and forth. America bombed Iran last year.
Yeah, the 12-day war.
Exactly. And the Gulf stayed out of it until the last hour of the war, when a single set of Iranian missiles were lobbed at an American military base, defined, limited, in many ways telegraphed. And while I think they would have killed if they could, it was very limited, and then it was over. And it was over because the Qataris helped mediate between Washington and Tehran. That moment was blown up in the opening hours of this war. So they lost that sense that their détente with Iran would buy them peace. Even the countries that had been the closest in different ways.
UAE?
UAE had been a financial conduit in some ways. And many Iranians had gone and lived there. They bit the hand that had fed them. Qatar, which shares a gas field and has been the most conciliatory international presence and mediator and facilitator for Iran in some ways alongside the United States, they too have been heavily bombed. And even Oman, which doesn't have that kind of deep American military presence, was bombed. It was declared a mistake, and then they were bombed again in their other major port and bombed in their oil refinery. So what the Gulf states have seen is that actually détente does not get deterrence, which they wanted. They can look to other powers and they can go to Russia, but Russia is busy. They can go to China, but China is not interested. They can go to Europe, but Europe can't replace the United States. They're a valuable partner. They can go to India for all kinds of technological ties and other things.
Not military.
But it doesn't do military or advanced semiconductors.
Yes.
And so they're kind of stuck. And I think they're going to have to think very carefully about exactly how they revive their how they recast their U.S. relationship, which I think will be largely intact, but subject to questions about how it should evolve, and also
probably
what
just
kind
take
of
your
détente they
bases
want.
away. I see that happening first.
Well, it's
take
an
your
interesting
bases
question.
away.
I think there will be that instinct, and I think that will be. I suspect that there will be strategic, professors of strategic studies in every country in the Gulf who have that view and write that essay. I know some of them, but I think that the bigger question will be whether the rulers who also understand that getting rid of the bases doesn't mean that Iran won't bully them and coerce them and attack them.
True. That also.
And it's not just Iran. That's the other thing. While Iran will be further weakened by this war, they may puff their chests out and show that they've stood down a superpower. We'll see how it ends. But they won't have the same stockpiles that they had before. They already don't have the proxies that they had before. But some of those other regional forces really do have a life of their own. The Houthis in Yemen.
Yeah,
that's
so I was just coming to that. The proxies are there. They haven't got involved so deeply, but they're probably holding their weaponry, waiting for that stockpile to be over.
And Mr. Benaim was President Biden's go-to man for the Arabian Peninsula. So I wanted to ask you about what the thinking of these GCC nations are. I mean, when you have missiles and drones being lobbed at them at a daily rate, why is there no retaliation from these countries who have spent billions of dollars on arms, on American arms essentially, to protect themselves? But they've still remained, they've focused on diplomacy, let's put it that way.
Yeah, right. I think it's a great question. I think if you look at this from the Gulf states' perspective, just as they have no great alternative strategically to where they are, in my view, they have very limited options before them here. Before this war, they were very clear, we don't want this war. And I believe that all of them were, notwithstanding some reports about the Saudi crown prince. I think probably none of them wanted this war. Because they knew that what happened could have happened. So they didn't want this. But once the war has started, I think the end state matters a great deal to them, in part because they are nearby. They don't have the luxury of distance that America or even Israel has. So for them, the end state inside Iran matters. For Israel, what Iran can project beyond its borders, or what Iran can project matters. But for Saudi Arabia, what security looks like inside Iran actually also matters, because you're talking about 95 million people next to a gulf of I think it must be 45 million people total that could empty out in refugee flows, in weaponry, smuggled weaponry, and different advanced capabilities, and terrorist groups or anything like that could all come out of this, or a kind of Syria 2.0 where different regional powers intervene. From the Gulf perspective, they want none of that. So they don't want to see a destabilized Iran or an Iranian civil war where Kurdish factions are up against other factions. So that is quite a scary scenario for them and quite a plausible scenario. But for them, they also, as much as that's kind of a worst case scenario, an Iran that comes out of this determined and resolute to create pain and instability like post-1971 Iraq is not great either, to be honest, because they are the closest and most vulnerable retaliatory point, as we saw. Their whole strategy, diplomatic, economic, military, the Gulf was the center of gravity, and Iran made the Gulf the center of gravity by going after them in these ways. And so for the Gulf, it's not great if you have a kind of Saddam-style rump state left over that can threaten them. So if that's the case, they want to see the full military campaign as envisioned probably go all the way through so that Iran's capabilities, its drones, its missiles, its command and control, and its navy are as weak as possible. Now, Iran can rebuild all of that stuff, especially if they have external support, but they'll have competing priorities.
From who?
Russia or China or others. We'll have to see.
Yeah. Do they have the capacity to now assist Iran in any manner? Like
Especially
Russia depleted already.
Yeah.
Right. I think if you look at both of them, they don't turn out to be such helpful backers for a country in need. I think, China is balancing between Iran and the rest of the Gulf. And, the press release that they put out that they had a $400 billion partnership with Iran turned out to be really more press release than reality.
Yeah. Whether Venezuela or Iran.
Right.
Both.
I think China, I think what China really wants to do in the world is sell the goods that they manufacture.
Yeah.
And I think that means that's I think actually part of the reason that the U.S. was able to exercise the kind of coercive power that they have, because the natural places that people would want to go.
It's just not a sexy term,
Right.
Supply chain king, supply chain power of the world.
But it is a facet of hard power, though.
Yeah.
China uses it as a tool of leverage for trade talks with America. Their supply chain choke points.
Sure.
So, what do you make of the recent news over here that President Trump has essentially delayed his visit to Beijing now till China doesn't help him clear out the Straits of Hormuz?
I think I saw that today.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, first of all, I'll believe it when I see it. I think he wants to go to China. He wants to have this meeting. He wants to cut a big trade deal, which they've been working on for months and months. And that's a big moment for him on the world stage. And I think he probably is resentful of the idea of it being taken away or distracted by what's happening in Iran. I think if he could end the war and go to China, I'm sure he probably would. And I think he may try to. Let's see if he really reschedules with Xi Jinping over this. So far, the United States exercised a great deal of aggressive economic policy against China. And China, really uniquely in the world, kind of was able to push back and marshal countervailing pressure through rare earth minerals that led to a kind of standstill, that led to the kind of economic agreements that I think Trump wants to go and sign. So I suspect that this is an important trip, and it'll land soon, notwithstanding whatever showmanship is happening at the moment.
Do you think Donald Trump miscalculated or underestimated Iran's response? And if there was a miscalculation and underestimation, was he led down that path by Bibi?
Yeah. So I think he did miscalculate in the sense that everybody knew that this was a possibility, and they seem to not have been as well prepared for it as they might have been in terms of having the assets nearby to reopen the strait, in terms of being ready to evacuate Americans from the Gulf, which is a core diplomatic responsibility for the safety and well-being of citizens overseas. That is like the absolute bread and butter of every diplomatic service overseas. That took several days, and really, I think in some ways our diplomats were caught by surprise by this surprise attack on Iran. And I think that we were caught by surprise by the fact that Iran's opening move out of the gate was to broaden the conflict in all of these ways. It took them a few days to really zero in on the energy weapon, but they went straight for the Gulf.
Yeah.
So they really had a strategy to broaden the conflict that seems to have caught us unawares. As far as whether that came from Netanyahu, I read this a little bit differently. I think that for the United States, I don't see a lot of evidence that Donald Trump is doing things for other countries. Evidence that I see is that he's doing what he thinks is good for the United States. And he defines the United States heavily in terms of his own movement and his own standing and his own strength as the embodiment of the country. I think he did this not because of Bibi, although Bibi may have provided some compelling arguments for Israel's desire to do it. He did it because he could, and because he thought he could do it at an acceptable cost. Now, Israel maybe was going to do it anyway, you could say. Yes, fine. But Donald Trump is much more popular in Israel than Benjamin Netanyahu, and Benjamin Netanyahu faces an election in 2026. Prime Minister Trump has levers to pull when he wants to pull them. So while one of the 12 explanations offered by the United States for this war was that Israel was going to do it anyway, I don't take that as seriously as the fact that we did it because Trump felt that he could, and he felt that he could do it at a reasonable cost. He has, I have to say, I give him credit for having a very good nose for the weakness of others and trying to understand how far he can push those limits. I think that, in my view, that underrates the long-term and medium-term erosion and damage that kind of approach does to the brand of American leadership that I and many others have supported for as long as I've been alive and since World War II. But I think that he has a certain genius for that kind of bullying and knowing where and when to push and how hard. I think that instinct really failed him in this case in understanding Iran's psychology and the fact that when pushed to a wall, they wouldn't capitulate and they wouldn't knuckle under in the way that they found Delcy Rodriguez. You know, the first supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini, has a quote that says something like, "I didn't do this revolution to change the price of watermelons." When you're talking about other countries that have a sense of national pride, and in many cases a civilizational sense of identity that runs not in a generation or two, but in centuries and millennia, it can be very hard to understand that those people also have their own politics before their own people, and they have their own national pride, and they may find that there is something worse than dying if you're the supreme leader of Iran, which would be to be captured and to end up in a prison in New York as the commander of your faith and the head of your country. And if you're 86 years old, you may rather die in your office.
Yeah.
And I think the sort of genius transactionalist element here failed President Trump in the face of a kind of different kind of ideology and motivation. Plus, you have to understand that there's an intoxication that comes with the power of the U.S. presidency or really any of these jobs. And I think President Trump could reasonably say that the prognosticators of doom have been telling him since he first arrived, since before he arrived, all the things that would go wrong. His first term would lead to World War III. He would move the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and that would start an intifada and a major problem. And P.S., it didn't. That he would go after Maduro, and we would end up on a slippery slope into a big war, or there would be any number of a bill of particulars. That actually, given what was at risk, went relatively well. Again, I'm not commenting on the long-term outcomes here. I'm talking on the near-term puts and takes. One day before, one day after type stuff. Last year when he went to war in Iran. Can you really just do one day of strikes? Are you going to end up with the kind of ugly surprise in warfare that I've been talking about? No, he did a day, and they managed to get in and out of the war in a day.
Yeah.
And that was because he had a very limited goal and a real discipline in getting out. And so I think it's possible that President Trump, and again, I say this as an outsider, sitting on an armchair, engaging in psychology.
No, but he is. You worked with President Biden. You worked with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who was a presidential hopeful too. Given the circumstances, how would they have reacted? What would they have done?
It's so hard to project from one of these situations to another. I think that for President Trump, he may have gotten to a point where he looked at this and said, everyone tells me that everything is going to go wrong, but I have a pretty good instinct for this kind of thing, and maybe the reason it hasn't gone wrong is me. And if I have a good instinct and a good feeling about this one, I'm going to give it a try. That is antithetical to the way that Americans have waged war, including the way that Secretary Clinton or Vice President Biden or any of these people really thought about the use of force. President Hillary Clinton was in many ways is an advocate of a very muscular American foreign policy, and a strong sense of deterrence and a sort of assertive presence on the world stage, morally, but also strategically and militarily. But a war, I think a lot of Americans who were part of the American political system in 2003 saw that there were limits to American wars of choice, especially in the Middle East, but a kind of open-ended war of choice with an indeterminate end, with an indeterminate goal. I don't think she would have bought it. It would have, for either of them, they would have been pained to see an Iran that retained some of its capabilities, its ability to threaten, its ability to endanger, its ability to endanger the people that it's hurt and endangered the most, who are the Iranian people. More than anybody in any other country. That's who's really suffered here. And they would have been inspired by the courage of the Iranian people. But I think ultimately they would have looked at this picture and said, boy, if we don't know how this ends, we're not just going to jump in and find out.
Is the threshold for the off-ramp for American victory too high? Because President Trump said he expects unconditional surrender from Iran. Iran's never really unconditionally surrendered anything, right?
No, I think, one of the hard things about analyzing U.S. foreign policy right now, people say a lot of things, including the president. And we're not used to somebody who both commands this kind of power and just says stuff. And then says something different, and then says a third or a fourth thing different. So yes, he said unconditional surrender, and that has a real impact strategically because it tells Iran that there's not an easy way out, perhaps, and that might cause them to take certain actions. But I think he would accept something far short of unconditional surrender at the right moment. If he felt like he could contain the nuclear program and find some way to deal with the missile program and end this war and get oil flowing again, I suspect he would take something far less than unconditional surrender. And frankly, he's shown a very interesting thing in this kind of ongoing experimental, improvisational, Trumpian way of war, which we've now seen in two countries, in Venezuela and in Iran, and which we've seen brandished in places like Cuba and even Greenland. But what we've seen is that he's kind of more comfortable dealing with a very transactional, authoritarian counterpart than in really rolling the dice on a big, messy, open-ended democratic transition. And so you see him implicating and drawing on the hopes of people who have lived under some of the worst governments, some of the most ineffective, isolating, counterproductive governments in these places that have tremendous mineral wealth, tremendous human capital. But in Venezuela, at least, what he did was, let's turn the tap on for the oil, and let's keep large parts of the regime in place in the short term and see what happens over time. And in Iran, I think he may have hoped for a similar outcome.
But while he's in a war, he's talking about another theater. He's talking about Cuba. And even before Iran, he was talking about Greenland. So it's this, a no-war president is, hunting for more and more theaters.
Yeah, I think that part of what happened is that, from his perspective at least, Venezuela went really well. From his perspective, Iran last summer went really well in the short term. And indeed, it left Iran in a position where its military program had been set back, and it was achieved at an acceptable cost. So I think part of what happened is that these examples begin to point to a pattern where he feels like he can use the power and the force of the American military toward these limited aims without the kind of strictures that Colin Powell had put in place, where don't do it unless you know how it's going to end. Go in with overwhelming force. What you break, you own. So if that was the way that America waged war in the 90s, we broke that principle in Iraq and Afghanistan and came to a disaster. And so I think you saw that kind of strategic doctrine take root. Trump is trying to create on the fly, impulsively, instinctively, his own different doctrine here. And I think that what happens in Iran may be very instructive in terms of what he feels he can do in other places, because it shows that the enemy has a vote here and that he needs to calculate a little bit more carefully about where and how these wars go on. Now, there are other questions here I want to be very clear about: international law, about U.S. domestic law, and about the wisdom over time of going from a country that provided a kind of international order to a country that is indispensable but unpredictable to the rest of the world. I would say that is unwise. But I think if we're talking about his way of war as measured on his terms, I would imagine that there's a lot of anxiety about what's happening right now.
Okay.
And I think that one of the two scenarios that I would want to mention, one would be, let's hope that this is a sobering effect when it comes to the use of force elsewhere, and that he reconnects to that idea that he had about the sort of more measured use of force, which would cost America and the world in terms of our deterrent force, but I think would be wise. The second piece is that none of us know what's going to happen in Iran after this war. And I really do think that while many of the arguments for this war fell away, the idea that all these good things might happen, in my mind, fell away pretty fast. The idea that this would be very limited and containable at the outset fell away pretty fast when he didn't declare victory that first week, which he could have, by the way. All those things fell away. But what's left is the idea that the Iranian regime is still weak. It's still lost a lot of its coercive force, and it's still vulnerable in front of its own factions and its own people. And while the factions of the regime are the ones with the guns and the ones with the most to lose, as even the president pointed out, we still don't know how that story will unfold for 93 million Iranians, probably 80% of whom oppose this regime.
Well, so if Iran were to sort of come out of this with Mujtaba Khomeini still in charge, large part of their armed forces still in charge, no American invasion, yet America may call it a win, but it would appear to be an Iranian win because they've survived a combined Israeli and American onslaught. So if you are a sheikh sitting in the GCC, you suffer from severe anxiety then because you have a wounded Iran sitting there claiming a win. What happens to the geopolitical arithmetic in the region then?
You know, it's a good question. And I think it's one of the problems with this war. And it's, one of the problems with small wars in general between big countries and smaller countries is that they win by not losing and you lose by not winning.
Sure.
That's the whole thing. So one way to get around that is to have a limited war. The other way to get around it is to just declare to everybody that you've won, let them declare that they've won, and find a face-saving way to move on. But that face-saving way gets harder and harder the longer you go and the murkier your goals are at the outset. And that's how you end up with concerns about what these 5 million Marines will do to create that off-ramp through additional...
5,000.
Right, 5,000.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is the worry for sure. But if you're a sheikh in the Gulf, I think you didn't want this war. You weren't consulted at the outset, but you also know that America was there for you before and during, helping you to defend yourself. And while you wish that they had made different choices about going to war, you can see that they are a partner who shows up. And they're the only country that's really strong enough to weaken Iran. And that even if by some miracle the Iranian government were to fall and what replaced them were not threatening to the Gulf, because they could easily have a nationalist Iranian from the Revolutionary Guard who deals with President Trump and continues to threaten the Gulf in some way. There's any number of scenarios that they would worry about. You still have the Houthis. You still have a giant missile arsenal right nearby. You still have Iraqi militias. So I think they're not ready for a post-American Middle East as much as they are seeing a kind of farewell to the idea that America... I think it's painful for them I should say, let me rephrase that. I think it's painful for them to think that America would have engaged in this war against their advice. Oh. And it's painful to them that their interest, despite the trillions of dollars that they pledged to invest, would be secondary at the end of the day to President Trump's decision to take this gamble and to go alongside the sort of Israel strategic vision of a more preemptive doctrine rather than a sort of de-escalatory money-making one that I think that they had hoped that they had sold President Trump on. Because remember, he went on his first big overseas trip last year. In May, he went to the Gulf. Yeah. And he said, look at what you're building. It's incredible. We're going to sell you microchips. We're going to bring all of our companies. We're going to bring...
funny globe that he was holding.
Oh, yes. That was 2017.
He got a 747. He got a plane as well.
He got a plane.
Out of it.
But you see, for decades, the hardliners in these Gulf countries, they had been more or less silenced, right? And accepted American military hegemony in this area. But after this attack which has happened, this fight between Iran and Israel and the US on the other hand, it's strengthened the views of the hardliners to say no to America. We need to have our own strength. Let's go back to the drawing board, redo our relationship with the West. It's going to result in some kind of a disruption from the known patterns that we have been seeing in the West Asia.
I think what ma'am just said, I want to also, if you can comment on the added dimension of, this Saudi-Pakistan military cooperation also that happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there will be voices in each of these countries that make exactly the argument that you are making. There already are. You can read them in countless think tanks like mine, counterparts across the Gulf. And they will raise legitimate concerns about what the United States has done and the choices that Donald Trump made. And I think those are all out there, and you can see them. And they're speaking to the genuine frustration that is felt.
Yeah.
The question will be is whether the rulers come to the same conclusion at the end of the day. I think in each of these countries, there are people who would like to move past the United States for one reason or another. but both economically, in terms of an AI vision, in terms of corporations, in terms of investment, in terms of human capital, the DNA sort of runs heavily through the U.S. private sector.
Sure.
And then the DNA militarily is a U.S. military DNA. Now, you can move past that. You can multipolarize if you want, but you lose that at your own risk. And I think that when push comes to shove, there may well be differences with America and with Tehran. Maybe they make different choices about what they want deployed in their territory, or the U.S. makes different choices about its force posture to put more things overseas, in ships. But at the end of the day, there's a security partnership here that I think may evolve, but will hold. I think that several Gulf states have their own worries that Iran will try to stir up instability inside their countries, and they have U.S. intelligence partnerships that are part of their effort to solve that. I do think that Gulf states, especially as Iran gets weaker over the last 2 years, are increasingly worried about Israeli hegemony in the Middle East. They're worried that without an Iranian counterweight, and Israel that is not only capable, as it's always been, but willing to go use force in more places more of the time with less compunction about it than it's ever been. That is not a situation that favors their strategy, their 2030 vision. So you really, in addition to having the 1979 vision that is coming at them from across the Gulf in terms of missiles and drones, you have this 10-7 vision that isn't their vision for how the region should work. Their 2030 vision for how the region should work is about calm. And if they see Israel as a regional destabilizing force, they'll look in various ways to mitigate that and counterbalance it. They will try to influence President Trump to do that. And I think at the moment they had some successes last year, namely the Gaza ceasefire and the normalization with Syria, both of which happened over the objections of Israel. But they also will look at this and say, our influence is somewhat limited here compared to Israel.
Also, these countries are not really vibrant democracies. The people have no say in the matter. So the rulers, as you said, of these countries, they have interests aligned with America. So the rulers decide and it doesn't matter. Whereas Netanyahu and Trump have elections coming, one midterm and the other has elections to deal with. So they have to do what their people tell them to. How much of the underwriting have people of America done for this war?
You know, one of the really puzzling things about this war, one of the really peculiar things about this war, as someone who graduated college in 2001 and saw, my first foreign policy experiences as a young adult were 9/11 and then these two American wars that in different ways stretched for 20 years. One of the things that became quickly apparent in both the run-up to the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War and the debates over the surge in Iraq and then the surge in Afghanistan, the withdrawal, the return, was something that David Petraeus used to talk about, which is that one of the centers of gravity for these wars is public opinion in your country. So one of the truly strange things, and I was sort of struck as you were even talking about it, about the idea that President Trump is beholden to the U.S. public when it comes to this decision, is that he never really sold this war.
Yeah.
He never really, I think he thought it would be short, but he also never really gave the American people something that they could hold on to, when you think about it, it was false. But you had, I think it was Condoleezza Rice who said that the smoking gun will be a mushroom cloud from the Iraqi WMD program.
And he's consulting with Condoleezza Rice now.
Right. No, what's old is new again. But I think that she's probably got a lot of strategic judgment to offer, and I suspect would have told him not to do this. But but I think that
was surprising.
But there is but there is uniformity in that neocon agenda about Iran. Condoleezza Rice, etc. They always wanted to eventually land up in Iran, and Trump-affiliated media organizations like Fox News and all have been doing the drumbeat about Iran from the get-go. Lindsey Graham is one example.
But the MAGA politics of this are actually quite interesting and heterodox. Because MAGA, Trump says MAGA is me. But, as when Iran has helped start these different groups and seeded them, and then they have a mind of their own, some of the people who took on this mantle of MAGA have a mind of their own, and they have their own thoughts, and they bought Trump's idea that we were doing too much overseas, that we spent too much blood and treasure in Middle Eastern wars, too much foreign aid, which I disagree with vehemently. basically too much of too many things. And they look at this and they say, what about what you told us? So there are actually plenty of Republicans who don't like this at all.
You're talking about Tucker Carlson's.
Tucker Carlson, and that's sort of one wing with its own particular jaundiced views.
Yeah.
But there are others who are more realpolitik and don't like this, or just are populist isolationists and don't like it, period. So I think actually, while the rank and file are maybe 80% supportive, that might change over time. And you do see, people even like David Sachs, who's a top AI official, who's kind of in and out of government and investment, saying that it's time to end the war, which was an unusual comment. I mean,
will it end before the midterms?
I think if you had asked me any time from the start of the war to about 2 days ago, I would have said it's going to end in March. It's going to end in March because the president wants to, and he'll be willing to cut the deal necessary. Yeah. But the bigger a show the closure of the Strait of Hormuz becomes, the bigger the world, the more the world fastens to that as the kind of strategic center of gravity of this fight, the more the United States will want to win in that area to end this war, or somewhere else, to look strong and not lose deterrence and lose face, which is so important to the president and to the U.S. deterrence generally. And the more Iran sees that they've created a spectacle and that they have a chance to really teach a lesson to the U.S. president. Remember, they have no air defense.
Yeah.
They're trying to figure out how to deter aggression against them by America and by Israel. And they know that their best chance to deter it against Israel is to deter it against America, so that America will tell Israel next time, don't do this. We're not with you. So Iran may decide that this is a teachable moment for them with the United States that they can't afford to forego, even if more Iranians get killed, even if they lose more military capability, even if the supreme leader continues to be targeted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I would have said it ends in March. I still think it ends in April, because eventually Iran will be able to declare victory with having imposed the kind of costs that they have, despite having lost every battle, military to military in this entire war. They'll feel that they can sell it to their own country. And eventually President Trump will see that none of the good things that he was hoping might happen when he launched this strategy will happen. But what will happen is he will achieve his military objective of weakening Iran's military capabilities, which is what he set out to do at the start of this war, and find an off-ramp from there.
How weak is it? For 23 years, they've been building missiles. And, 2 weeks of hitting those dumps. They've been taken underground, I believe.
Yeah.
Nobody really knows, but they say they've been taken underground, and they've been building them, thousands and thousands of them, and they've been moving them around. So whether it's degraded or not, I mean, who's to judge? Look at what they did with Hezbollah. Everybody said it's over, Hezbollah decapitated, and they're back. So how does one know whether, you've degraded their missile capability or not?
I think, well, first of all, you have intelligence agencies that are making these kinds of judgments, but they have things that they don't know as well, I'm sure. But, there are various elements of a missile program. There are factories that create these missiles. There are senior officials with the know-how and the leadership to direct them. There are launchers that are required to use them. There are precursors and components that are sourced from overseas. And then there's the brigades that actually fire them. And then there are the missiles themselves. So you take all of these elements, and I think a smart military campaign, which I'm quite confident that both the United States and Israel had, since this was a uniform military
A precise
engaging,
one.
Right, are engaging every part of that value chain from start to finish to try to find as many weak points as they can to create as big a disruption as they can. Now, the question of what a degraded capability looks like is a real one. Let's say you can only do 10% as many missiles as you can, and you still have a lot of drones, kamikaze drones. Or let's say you get to zero, but then you create the program again over the next 2 years.
Yeah.
Part of the problem with this kind of approach is that you create the pretext for more war, or if it's really unsatisfying, you create the pretext for bigger war, which is what happened ultimately in Iraq, where from 1991 to 2003, you had a very unsatisfying denouement that then led a future president to decide that it was time to go for the ultimate. So I think they can actually very meaningfully weaken Iran in the short term, and probably even in the medium term, and maybe deter them. And maybe their view is, we'll push this to a manageable place where Iran can't overwhelm the defenses of the region. We'll ramp up our defensive capabilities, all of which comes at a cost, since missile batteries have come out of Korea, Ukraine, and elsewhere to create this space. But we will ultimately be able to defend against those things, and we'll have time. And if we see them reconstituting, we'll use all of our military means or covert means or otherwise to go after and degrade them again. That may work for Israel, which was really worried about being overwhelmed. But for the Gulf states, again, you don't have the luxury of distance. And frankly, for them, the idea that we're going to go to war every year for the next 10 years over this program casts a big dark cloud over the dreams that they had when the president came last May to build that 2030 region.
Yeah, what do you make of President Trump's allegation that it was essentially President Biden's administration that gave billions, as he likes to put it, billions to the Iranian regime by unfreezing funds that were there, and that money essentially went straight into this missile program and created what Iran is today right now, with a better missile program than what it was earlier. And President Trump is essentially going in there to clean up the mess that the Biden administration had caused.
Yeah, I mean, I think President Trump has an unerring ability to find and locate the fault for various policies with others. But I think that, when President Biden left office, Iran was at its weakest point that it had been in strategically in 47 years. The reports about Iran getting billions and billions of dollars from President Biden, I think, were inaccurate. They had some money that was held in escrow by Qatar and South Korea.
$6 billion.
Right, but
Sizable
they didn't get that money. That's the thing. They never got that money. So it's kind of a conflation of a whole bunch of things that are not accurate. Now, it's true that Iran continued to enrich, and there's blame to go around for the fact that you had a nuclear deal in place and that President Trump left it without a plan to create something better, and that then President Biden arrived and didn't re-enter a nuclear arrangement that would constrain Iran's nuclear program. They focused instead on the post-October 7th Middle East. They focused instead on building these other relationships, and it was a problem that was left there with Iran having advanced uranium for the next president to have to solve. That was a real issue. It was a weakened Iran. There was significant leverage, but Iran had a stockpile of highly enriched uranium that they'd have to solve. But that wasn't the critique that President Trump was making. His was kind of a tabloid collage of different partial truths. But I think actually there is an Iranian threat. There are these capabilities, and the nuclear program is a real issue. But the possibility existed. One of the reasons that President Biden couldn't solve it was because the Iranians were afraid that if President Trump came back to power, he would rip it up, and they didn't want to make concessions to allow that. President Trump, because he had destroyed the first deal, ironically, had a chance to consolidate Republican support alongside probably reluctant Democratic support for a new nuclear arrangement with Iran. And even after bombing Iran last June, he may have had that possibility before this war again. But it gets back to that idea about starting the revolution over the price of watermelons. They were not going to capitulate and surrender and be humiliated in the eyes of their people to deal with this program. They were going to find something that gave them a way to declare a win and gave the world a way to make sure that whatever remained of their nuclear program would be transparently administered, probably visible from space, and managed and contained.
Yeah. But see, the JCPOA essentially said that under 4% uranium was the agreement, got ripped up, you said. But tell me what goes in the mind of a U.S. president when President Biden is seeing Iran going up in the enrichment ladder to almost 60%. And a lot of quantity of that 60%. At what point would you intervene and insist Iran to stop their nuclear enrichment, or just stop it, or open it up to IAEA inspectors and to put the brakes on it? I mean, that's some of the credible, the allegations from the Trump administration. Those are the only credible points that we could think of, honestly.
Yeah, I think this was an unsolved issue at the end of the Biden administration. There were a lot of other issues, and Iran was weakened in a variety of ways, and they were very focused on working with Israel, but they didn't manage to create a successful major agreement. They had minor agreements, and the minor agreements slowed the path and made sure that some additional fire breaks remained and were not broken. Now, when you talk about building a weapon, you talk about both the weaponization part of the program and the delivery, which is subject to controversy, but didn't seem to be happening in a serious way, as best I could tell from where I sat. And then on the other hand, you talk about enrichment of uranium. And there, too, they weren't at weapons grade, despite the fact that they had taken some troubling steps. And that, like, let's be honest, nobody needs 60% enriched uranium for anything. 20% even is the maximum you need in small amounts for a hospital isotope.
So this is for weapons.
So what they were doing was threatening in some ways, but it wasn't the same as a program to weaponize, detonate, deliver a nuclear weapon overseas, which is what we traditionally talk about as weaponization. So there were steps there, but frankly, that was a troubling part of the situation. And I think, had there been an additional time horizon to deal with this program by a Biden or a Harris or anybody else over the following years, I suspect you'd have seen them return to these questions. And just as Trump did, incidentally, because at the end of the day, short of regime change or this kind of costly, unpredictable mow the lawn strategy that we're now in with our second war in 2 years with Iran, which we were told that getting out of the nuclear program, nuclear agreement wouldn't lead to war, and we've had 2 wars in the last 2 years with Iran. But I think short of that, you're left with diplomacy. And I think Donald Trump, there's still a deal maker in him that still wants to find some way to reach that agreement.
Let me come to the India perspective now. India's had close strategic ties with Israel as well as other countries in the Middle East. From Washington's perspective, how does India's cautious approach look right now? Is there appreciation for India's strategic prudence, or the strategic ambiguity is something which Washington doesn't want to understand at all?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I won't speak for all of Washington, but I mean, I see, when you think about how India came out after the Iraq War as a sort of basic, making a basic argument against on the grounds of kind of longstanding principles, I see India taking a very different geostrategic role here. And I think that India's relatively understated approach in response to this war is a statement of its own, that they have a close strategic relationship with Israel. They have very important relationships across the Gulf on both sides of the water with the Gulf countries especially, but they have a reasonable relationship with Iran. You get gas from Qatar, and I understand that the disruptions affect everything from tuk-tuk driving to, petrochemical and advanced manufacturing to even cremation practices that go to really elemental aspects of the life cycle. So I think
don't listen to too much of the podcast about cremation cycles. There aren't many crematoria in India which use gas. It's just in a few cities, and that is also not the preferred way of cremation. But then anything to do with cremation, Western media pounces on that story. But anyway, that's aside.
This is our trauma from the COVID coverage that Western media did with the mass crematoriums and mass stuff that was going
that's
on.
actually extremely useful to know. I did, this goes to show that you shouldn't believe everything you read, because I did read this in the foreign press, and so it is quite useful to know. But I think when it gets back to the question of India and India's strategic position, I think like many countries in many places, you're trying to play it smart. You need energy supplies.
We do.
You have very important strategic relationships everywhere.
And we have development goals which we have to arrive at. None of the wars we have ever seen are ethical or moral. So siding with an ethically or morally right side doesn't matter. Right now we have goals to achieve, to reach. We are a middling economy, or we're not even a middling economy as yet. We need to get there, right? So explain how the Trump administration would be viewing this right now, that we are taking the easy way out. This ambiguity is not being on their side of it, the war, not on their corner?
I don't know. There's probably limits to exactly how far I can go in projecting myself into the minds of some of the characters who are the architects of this war. But I think that, U.S.-India relations are an incredibly important and strategic thing.
Okay.
And I think that that's recognized widely. You've got an ambassador here now. Who
he means well,
determined to take this relationship and make it work and make it sing and kind of regain this momentum. And I think that part of the reason for the quiet may be that not wanting to rock the boat either with the allies and partners in the Middle East, but also trying to find an approach that works with the United States. And that's incredibly important because this relationship is, it's really on the very, very short list of the most defining relationships of the century. And we've had a rough stretch. And we need to get it right. So I do think that I don't think that India is on the front lines of the Trump administration's pressure to other countries to come in and help, because I think people understand, and they probably are getting a more accurate view of India now by virtue of having an empowered ambassador on the ground to help them understand the strategic perspective of this country and this government.
We are having bilateral agreements and bilateral negotiations essentially, and it's a work in progress with Iran. We got a few LPG tankers, LNG tankers out, and we still many more to go. So you are seeing direct negotiation, and you're seeing a working relationship between two nations actually bearing results. Which nations do you think America could pair up with to try and get an off-ramp and some sort of consensus in ending this war?
Yeah, it's a great question, and in many ways it's the right question, because I think that there are a lot of countries who are looking at this and one way or another are losing. I think, unfortunately, Russia is making money hand over fist over this war, but a lot of countries are losing. Our allies are seeing a degree of strategic distraction in other regions that is troubling, and I think that the Gulf states are seeing not only losses, week by week, but a kind of damage to their model and their way of doing business. So I do think that there are plenty of likely suspects to engage in a kind of bilateral search for an off-ramp. The Gulf states have traditionally played this role. It has been dangerous business to be a mediator in the Middle East over the last several years.
Yeah.
Qatar was bombed by Iran and Israel for their role. Oman was bombed by Iran. Iran is now talking about finding a regional solution, which I think is part of their enlisting the Gulf states again to do it, but it's not clear to me that anyone will raise their hand.
Fragmented already. I mean,
well, there is that issue too, and you were asking about Pakistan earlier, and I do think Saudi and Pakistan have this partnership, although Saudi really also values its strategic relationship with India, and I think is determined to do it all in that way.
But it seems to have ignored India right now and asking Pakistan to I don't know whether it's boots on the ground, whether it's their nuclear deterrent. What do they want? What does Saudi Arabia want of Pakistan, you think?
I think that this thing was in some ways less than met the eye. It was a declaration that Saudi Arabia had places to go, that it wasn't straitjacketed into a vision of the Middle East alongside Israel that it didn't like. It could go to Turkey, it could go to Pakistan, it could go to France, it could go to anybody to not be locked into a relationship with an America and Israel when Israel was striking out at Doha next door and hitting inside the GCC. I think that offended them deeply and offended their idea of what their security relationship with the United States meant and of what regional order they were trying to build. So they have that relationship, and it will have some tactical benefits, I think. Maybe Pakistan will get some business dealings out of it. Maybe they'll work together on jets for Sudan or something like that. There'll be smaller pieces. But to think that this is a strategic relationship that is a defining one for the Saudi perspective, I think is not quite right. And frankly, I think over time, having heard from just about all the GCC states, it's pretty clear that they see India as a future superpower, not just as a sort of place to receive labor and send capital, but as a major arbiter of 21st century life. If not immediately, then certainly over time. That's the direction of traffic. They all see it. They all admire it. That's why you have a deal with a country like Oman, but it's also why Modi and Mohammed bin Zayed have this exceptionally close relationship. The Saudis see that too. And I think that they probably are calculating that whatever they feel they want and need from Pakistan as a matter of security, they're determined to compartmentalize that part of their relationship from the big, broad strategic ties that they want to India. And of course, it hasn't been talked about a lot in recent years because the various players have fragmented in various ways at various times. But you still have the idea of IMEC, the idea of an India, Middle East, Europe corridor out there. And
whenever it happens.
right, it does feel like it's sort of
Yeah,
always
well-
tomorrow's idea.
Yeah.
But Pakistan is being kept busy by Afghanistan at this point. So
Yeah.
they have their own issues right now. But I'm coming back to my questions. Which country do you think can help with an off-ramp?
So I would put my money on Qatar and Oman as the countries that have done this before, and then on France as a country that has a very intrepid, historically intrepid diplomatic approach, and is sending their ships to the region and may see a role for themselves in doing this. They're already working with Saudi Arabia on something for Lebanon, it seems. It's been reported that would be a kind of path to recognition for Lebanon with Israel, but also a path to end the war, which has quietly displaced almost 1 million Lebanese people during the time of this war. So while everyone's focused on Iran, there is this other battle in Lebanon, and France is very engaged there and very engaged with Gulf states. So it wouldn't surprise me if you saw some combination of France and the Gulf playing this kind of a role.
President Trump has not been kind to Emmanuel Macron. Do you think it'll be palatable for him?
Countries have a funny way of coming back after all of this, and most places, most of the time, following their interests. And when they need to, shaking this off to follow their interests, shaking off the insults and stuff. I will just say it is deeply not my way of doing business in the world. I do think respect matters in international relations, and I think it creates the antibodies for a moment when American leadership is less indispensable for countries to just make a different choice because they don't like it. The comic insult diplomacy. But I think that Emmanuel Macron is a grown-up and will make a grown-up decision to help the national interests of France, which mostly lie in working with the United States and trying to make peace in the Middle East.
You've given excellent context and everything, but now I want you to speculate and just give me a conclusion over here. Do you see this war ending with an Iranian win? And when I say win, I mean the regime, Mujtaba Khomeini and everyone, they survive.
So I see this war ending with the Iranian regime, as we've known it, fundamentally changed, but not eliminated. And I think I see it in that way because the Iranian regime has already fundamentally changed. It wasn't just the supreme leader who was killed in this war and the last war. It was most of the next 40 people in charge of the system. The supreme leader was the longest-serving authoritarian ruler in the world. 37 years he had shaped and architected this program. Now his son, who by many accounts is wounded and hasn't been seen publicly, and who is really a creature of the security services rather than a charismatic, credentialed cleric in his own right, he's ostensibly the leader. That's already a giant difference. So I don't know if Mujtaba Khomeini will live or die in the next year period of war. That's beyond my predictive powers. But I know that Iran already looks different than it did. And I know that at least during the period of this war, it strikes me as quite unlikely that either the United States or Israel will successfully topple the Iranian regime and replace it with another regime altogether. So in my mind, that leads to a scenario where whoever is in charge, whether it's Mujtaba or somebody else, can declare victory and say the Iranian revolution lives on to fight another day. But that doesn't mean that they have solved their problem with their own people, who still are profoundly against this government and want to see something profoundly different for their own future. And I think, frankly, probably look at the kinds of possibilities and dynamism that happen in a place like India and global interconnectivity and say, we want some of that.
Okay, probably. So finally, let me come back to U.S. domestic politics. You worked with Democrats. If President Trump doesn't do well in the midterms, are the Democrats ready with a leader? Who's the face?
One of the great things about being a public servant and getting to work in nonpartisan foreign policy and going to work, and when you have to get an American who's wrongfully detained out of jail overseas, you don't ask, so who did you vote for in the last election? We never ask that. I think for me, it's having a little break from politics was great. I'm now back in private life. What I want to see is somebody who is ready to carry forward a generational shift of leadership in the party and bring together various different forces and factions and have a kind of clear leadership vision What you're seeing are people who, one way or another, have entered that conversation based on their individual achievements in office in various regions of the country with various political ideologies. Nobody has yet really shown in the way that like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton had shown, or Joe Biden had proven over a half century in public life, that they have all the pieces and that they uniquely have all the pieces. So what I'm really looking for is to see who can make that argument the best to the American people. So Democratic electorate in the first instance, but then to the Americans. There are a dozen people who are incredibly talented, who ran states that have deep political divides and ran them in a way that united people and reached across that aisle and ran them in a way that was conciliatory and
we
enlightened.
in India can't see anybody because, see, when it was Biden, we knew what his views about India were, right? Because as Vice President, we knew what it was. With Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, we knew because she was with Bill Clinton. So they had all been to India. They had seen India. They knew India. There was a support for India in the Democrat camp at that time. Right now, the names that are coming up, none of us can think of any names.
Well,
who are the India hands there?
There are many names, and I think there are many India hands. You know, you have Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell and many others who are out in the public arguing for a new, deeper strategic relationship with India.
As presidential hopefuls?
Oh, I don't think they're running for... No, exactly. I think they'll be the kinds of people who the president listens to when it comes to India, probably, depending on who this person is. But I think part of what will happen, and we've done this before. In 1992, you had a field of Democratic contenders who were affectionately labeled by the media as the Seven Dwarfs. And it turned out that one of the Seven Dwarfs was William Jefferson Clinton, who ran the country for 8 years and was really turned out to be a luminous intellect and well capable of carrying forward this vision. And began
followed
some
a
of
war
the
president.
Right. So exactly, and defeated and then followed for a president war. So I think what will have to happen is that as we make this generational change in leadership, there will be people who will learn on the fly. I do think that when it comes to India, though, this is one of the places where I think Washington, when it comes to the depth of this strategic partnership, the music that we've sung about this relationship for the last 20 years, about the world's oldest democracy and its largest democracy, about the stable and free Indo-Pacific, about counterterrorism and trade and tech, all those fundamentals are still strong. We had some friction that was caused, I think, over this last year, but we didn't have a fracture.
Yes.
Right, we had some real problems.
And Lindsey Graham and these
Navarro. We had our problems, but I think the fundamentals are really strong, and I also think that India and the strategic partnership with India is an 80-20 issue in Washington. It's just that the 20 have a particular voice right now. That's not to say that it'll be easy, but I do believe that the possibility of recovering and strengthening this relationship in a future administration is really limitless. And getting back to the work we've been doing, I think what was interesting to realize on this trip for me was that this relationship has had an unbelievable wind at its back and momentum behind it for 20 plus years. And in many ways, that sense of momentum created a kind of feeling that empowered everybody who was trying to bring it forward, from the Quad to the ISET and the tech relationship. And I think part of what happened in 2025 is we kind of lost the vibes. And the power of those vibes over these 20 years, I think we hadn't quite realized what it meant to have the wind at our backs in that way. I think we'll have it there again. I think that we'll have it there again. And what I hope is that it doesn't take the end of the administration to do it. I hope that we can do it even sooner, because there's no time to lose, in my view, in taking what should be this defining strategic partnership, getting it back to where we want it, and taking it to where we believe it can go.
Okay, on that optimistic note, I think we should wind up this conversation, because there's really less